to waste your time. And so let's see, would you mind offering a prayer for us this afternoon?
Uh-huh.
Okay, thank you so much.
Dear Father in heaven, we're thankful for the ability to meet online and to be instructed in the history of the fight for liberty, and the reminder it gives us help it continue to thrive. We ask that thy Spirit be with us today and throughout this week, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Wendy. Okay, well, so James Otis, The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved. Did you get a chance to read it?
Uh-huh.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's dive in here. Okay. There we go. Okay, so to understand Otis, we have to start by going back to 1763 and talk about Britain's financial woes. It's very interesting to note these statistics, and I hope that we'll be able to consider them carefully. So when the French and Indian War ended, it lasted about 7 years. It was called the 7 Years' War in Europe. Ended in 1763. It created a huge debt and had left Britain with a national debt that had doubled to 135 million pounds by the end of the war. It's interesting to note that 135 million pounds is compared to the scant 10 million pounds in revenue that Britain was earning and taking in 1763. So as you can see, they had this huge debt problem. Also, in 1763, you may know or you may not know that the average resident of England was paying about 20% of household income in taxes, while the average American, however, was paying only 1%. Well, as England was thinking about what they could do to start righting their ship of finance, they estimated that it cost about 400,000 pounds a year to maintain their presence in North America. And so what they decided to do was that to help with expenses in the colonies, they wanted America to start paying for half of it, 200,000 pounds. You know, it's interesting because to us we might say, wow, what would the Americans complain about? But it's important to note that any increase from 1% seemed like a lot. And so that perception of oppression was incredibly important. As we'll also talk about today, more than just the finances, though, was the principle behind what was happening, and that's what made Americans even more upset. And we'll talk about representation and consent and go back to those principles of Locke and the Glorious Revolution that we talked about.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I remember reading in McCullough's 1776 book that when the British soldiers arrived in New York, they were just amazed at the wealth of the Americans and felt really kind of angry that the Americans had anything to complain about because they thought that they were so well off. So obviously the British were aware that they were paying more taxes than the Americans, but were the Americans aware that they were paying 1/20th of the amount of taxes that the British were paying?
Right, yeah. They were aware, but it was very interesting because as you read their arguments, I mean, you would think that they were paying, 85% of their income in taxes.
Right.
Really. But what it was the fact that not only did they not want to be taxed, because of course, anything that hurts the pocketbook in some ways hurts the heart, okay, but it was that they didn't have consent in the taxation. And so that's when we'll get into the difference between virtual representation and actual representation, and the colonists who wanted actual representation in the British Parliament, and those who said, well, virtual representation, can never work, and neither can actual, and so really, there's no way, and they'll never have legitimacy for what they're doing if things don't change in some drastic way. And so, yeah, they did know that they were getting it off easy, but at the same time, there are many arguments, and actually, as we read Jefferson, it's very interesting. In his summary view of the rights of British America, he talks about that when Americans migrated from England, that they started what could be called a new state of nature, and they got to just set the new terms. And so there wasn't any legitimacy at all for Britain to tax them. Anyway, so there are lots of arguments involved in this, and it's really interesting to see their perception. And Bernard Bailyn, a famous historian who we've quoted a couple times here of the American Revolution, has talked about how perception of reality is the only workable reality. It's what people think is happening to them that really is what matters. And so here we see these people feeling so oppressed. And so let's talk about some of those reasons why.
But so you're saying that they did know that they were paying 20 times less.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And let's see. I think did someone try to join us and then leave? Oh no, Walter, you're with us, right? Hello, Walter.
Hello.
Hi, Walter. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Well, we're happy to have you today. So Grenville, George Grenville was the British Prime Minister, and he would be Prime Minister from 1763 through 1765. And he tried to remedy Britain's financial woes by creating a program of taxation for revenue. If you remember, they had a debt of 135 million pounds, and they were only taking in 10 million. So they really needed to up the revenue. And so what he said is, well, let's stick it to the colonists a little bit more so they can pay their fair share of what's going on here in the empire. And so we have these two acts for revenue. The Sugar Act of 1764, which interestingly enough actually lowered the taxes for the colonists from the 1733 Act, the Molasses Act, but the 1733 Act wasn't enforced. But now Grenville told the colonists, and he set up means by which he would enforce it. So even though it was less, they felt it this time, whereas they didn't in 1733, so it really was a big deal to them. And then the Stamp Act, which we'll talk about during our next class when we talk about Daniel Delaney, hurt them even more because it affected them at all levels of society, and really they felt was just so intrusive into their homes, into their daily lives. Along with Grenville's program were also two other acts. The Currency Act of 1764, which said that the colonies couldn't print money anymore for the time being, and then also the Quartering Act, which, of course, as we know, British officers could say, we don't have enough barracks, and so you need to provide room and board for X amount of soldiers, and you can't say anything about it. And so those were also part of Grenville's plan for reforming the colonies, who he felt had been getting off too easily for far too long. Well, of course, there's a colonial response to this as we continue talking about the context to Otis, who you've read. The constitutionality of parliamentary taxation was called into question by a flurry of polemical pamphlets. And so these pamphlets many of them are the ones that we're going to read in class. And the best known of these, and the one that we're going to start our study of the American Revolution with, is the one written by James Otis that you read for today. And let's learn a little bit about Otis then. So here he is. And how many of you, or have either of you been to Boston?
I have.
You have? Have you walked the Freedom Trail?
It was probably, no, I mean, I'm 15 years ago. I don't remember.
Okay. Well, if you did walk the Freedom Trail, part of the trail is a very famous and old burial ground called the Granary Burial Ground. And this granary, spelled granary, this Granary Burial Ground has the tombs and the graves of John Hancock, Paul Revere, the parents of Benjamin Franklin, the 5 victims of the Boston Massacre, as well as James Otis. And so that's where you can go and see his stone if you like in the future. Well, a little bit more about Mr. Otis. So 1725 to 1783, it's actually sad because during the last years of his life, he suffered from mental illness and by many accounts sort of became a raving lunatic. And the acute mind of a lawyer that had been so helpful to the colonies ended up being sort of wasted by this disease at the end. Anyway, but in his prime, he was an eloquent lawyer in Boston, a representative to the House of Representatives in Massachusetts. He graduated from Harvard, started practicing law 1748, and I don't know if any of you have heard of the writs of assistance case in Massachusetts in 1761. Anybody heard of that? Well, in 1761, after the death of George II in 1760, there were many things that were up for renewal, and many acts. And among these was this Writs of Assistance Act. And a writ of assistance was that basically you could think of it as a search warrant, but the assistance part of it was that the local constable had to go with the person who was doing the searching. And now, why might this be a problem, do you think? Why would the colonists object to this? Any
What's
ideas?
a constable? A police? Is that a police force?
Yes. Yep.
Job?
Yeah.
Constable? Oh.
Why would that be a problem? If say your neighbor was going to be searched for something, and if you Wendy were the constable, why would you maybe not want to go and do that search with the British official?
Would it appear that I was siding with them, with the British?
Okay. Perhaps. If you think also about the implications on your relationship with your neighbor, how might that perhaps negatively affect that relationship?
Well, that's what I meant. I mean, kind of like the Romans hiring Jews to collect taxes for Rome. It would make people, it would appear that you were siding with Rome or with Britain, and you would become like the publicans, very hated.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm sorry, I missed your meaning there. But yeah, exactly. Right. And so these writs involved colonists when they didn't want to be involved in their neighbor's business. Nobody wants to be a bad guy with your neighbor. And so it's interesting because Otis is quoted as saying here, "Without evidence, I don't have to open my door to anyone. My right from God, from nature and society, and from my right as an Englishman. So the warrants and the writs should be void." And so it's interesting here because even though these warrants were very specific, in fact, they said that there needed to be a specific cause, there needed to be a specific site that was specified, and that they only could occur during the day. But the colonists felt that still wasn't enough evidence for a British official to go into your home to search it, and especially to go with, Bob, who lived down the street, who would then be involved in your affairs, which may or may not have been illegal. Anyway, and so Otis argued this court very eloquently. Unfortunately, though, he lost, and the Massachusetts court ended up reinstating these writs of assistance. They renewed them. And it's interesting, though, because this argument, even though he lost in court, would succeed in the long run because he correctly identified the principles that were at stake in the Revolution, right? Sort of this power, what is government's right? Is government to rule? Is it to tell us what to do? Or do we tell the government what to do? Do we give the government legitimacy? Do we give consent for its life, its very being? And so, anyway, so the Otis was famous for this case even before he wrote the pamphlet that you read an excerpt from today. And also, he was a strong opponent of royal power in Massachusetts, and then this pamphleteer who would attack authority to tax in the colonies by Parliament in 1764. And so you've read The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, which is his most famous pamphlet and the most famous of all the pamphlets written about this topic. And so now I want to get to our 4Ring, now that you've had some context. So I want you to first reason, where does Otis say that absolute power originally resides? What do you think, Walter? Do you remember that from your reading?
He says that it resides, absolute power originally resided in the people.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And that's from the first page, right, that first paragraph. I say supreme absolute power is originally and ultimately in the people, and they never did in fact freely, nor can they rightfully make an absolute unlimited renunciation of this divine right. So, once again, who does this sound like? Who we've read.
Well, it sounds like all the Commonwealth men that we've been reading. In fact, I struggled to find an original idea in Otis.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons why I chose Otis first, not as well as it being just an important early pamphlet. But I love what you said there, Wendy. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I was trying to find an idea that he puts forth in here that he that would be his own, an idea we hadn't heard before, and in our reading. And obviously we didn't read very much, but
Right.
I could hardly find anything that was just a new idea. He seems to pretty much parrot Locke and others, and I don't know, maybe the only thing that I could find that was original to Otis was maybe this idea that living alone is unnatural, a state of hermitage is unnatural for humans. I didn't read that in any of the other readings she gave us.
Right.
Or the idea that leaders try to trick people into thinking that they're omniscient or omnipotent. But other than that, it was kind of a parroting of the stuff we've already read.
Yeah, Wendy, thank you for pointing that out. That actually, you've proven the point that I hoped to make today, which was that look at the influence of the Glorious Revolution, right? Just 100 years before, we've read Milton, we've read Harrington, Sidney, Locke, Trenchard, and Gordon, right? And look at how we see their words, their ideas, really just taken and pasted onto the pages of history of the American Revolution. So, as you were thinking perhaps this weekend about the significance of the Glorious Revolution, well, here it is, right, in plain view, in this influence, this great influence that it had on the American Revolution. And so once again, we see God's hand, right, in the formation of the American colonies and the American nation, giving them that heritage of liberty and that struggle for rights and consent from the British. And so what better people to found this great nation before it even became a nation of its own. So thank you for that. Well, here's a question then. What did Otis say about how power can be delegated? And once again, this shouldn't be new. But what did he say? And if you can find a quote, that's even better. But you don't have to find one if you just remember what he said.
This is a quote. It says, "Idolatry begotten by flattery on the body of pride." And I think that's I think that well, I guess I may have written the wrong thing down here. I kind of wrote the questions down, but
Okay. Well, just out of curiosity, even though this doesn't quite relate, but what interested you about that quote, Walter?
I can't quite remember.
Okay.
I think it was last night, and I had written down the questions, and I was writing the answers to them. And so I think I just put the wrong one for this.
Okay.
Well, yeah.
I've got a quote if you want one.
Sure. Thanks, Wendy.
The last one on page 3, that the large body of people have made it necessary to transfer the power of the whole to the few just because of inconveniences of trying to have all that many people involved. But I also thought that almost conflicts with what he says on the first paragraph on page 1, where he says that the people can, it says, they never did in fact freely, nor can they rightfully make an absolute unlimited renunciation of this divine right. So I guess he's distinguishing between renunciating your rights and just delegating them.
Right, yeah, and that is a great distinction to make because truly, I mean, and really this is what our Constitution is founded on, right? We the people, okay? You think about the Constitutional Convention and the debates going on and, James Wilson talking about the sovereignty of the people. It's very interesting because, Otis would say, hey, sure, I can say, okay, I want representatives because, yeah, like you said, for convenience sake, we can't all go to Washington or wherever to make decisions. But ultimately, we are the source of power. We've just given them a longer cord, right? But they're plugged in to us, right? Their authority and their power is plugged into us, and we can unplug it if they're not doing what we think they should, right? That's what Otis is saying, that, we can't not be the source of power, right? But we can plug in others into our power and delegate it. Thank you so much for that. As we think about this, I mean, I just, it's interesting. I haven't thought much about it myself, I would say probably before this year. But what do we think about delegating power. I mean, how do you feel about that? Would you prefer to have a direct democracy all the time, sort of, Athenian style, where, we would be able to just vote on everything all the time? I mean, what do you think?
I think a direct democracy is a mobocracy, and the only way that I can conceive of it working, it would be inconvenient no matter what, but in order to do that, you would have to have certain inalienable rights. You'd have to say, these are things that the majority cannot vote to take away from the minority. But even then, I don't see it working well. And I think it's important, an important distinction on another topic, to say that although the people may delegate their power, I don't think that Congress has the right to do that. If the Constitution says only Congress can negotiate a trade treaty or declare war, I don't think Congress can delegate that power to the President. If the Constitution says, if it actually outlines that that's a power only they can have.
Yeah, thank you for those points, Wendy. Those are excellent. What about you, Walter? I mean, how do you feel about representation? How do you feel about delegating your power?
Well, I think that kind of just what's already been said. I don't think like the direct democracy, I think that would not work very well. And it would it could turn into the majority taking things away from the minority.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you for that. I'm grateful, and I hope that we're thinking about questions like this as we're reading these sources and not taking them for granted. Not that I think you are. It's just more of a general statement. And so, okay, the next one then. So as we think about representation, right, and giving it to other people to represent us, right, that power that we have, right, what does representation have to do with the power to tax? What do you think, Walter?
What was the question again?
Well, can you reason what representation has to do with the power to tax? And can you see my screen, Walter?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great.
Well, I don't think that if you're not represented, then it's just that's kind of, well, it's just you can't, if you're not represented, you can't take anything away from someone, and that's, I don't know, it's just kind of seems like it almost should be kind of obvious to people that representation, you have to represent to have people tax you.
Okay. And so as we think about that, right, what is the power to tax, really? What is it? What does taxing do?
I think it's the power to take away property.
Yeah. No, that's what I was hoping you'd say, right? The power to take away property. So now this takes us to what Otis spends a little bit of time talking about. He talks about the purpose of the government. What does he say the end of government is, the purpose of it?
To promote the best good of the people.
To promote the best good of the people. And if we could turn together to page 1 and go to the very last paragraph, I want to read this together. It says, the end of government, being the good of mankind, points out its great duties. It is above all things to provide for the security, the quiet and happy enjoyment of life, liberty, and property. There is no one act which a government can have a right to make that does not tend to the advancement of the security, tranquility, and prosperity of the people. If life, liberty, and property could be enjoyed in as great perfection in solitude as in society, there would be no need of government. But the experience of ages has proved that such is the nature of man, a weak imperfect being, that the valuable ends of life cannot be obtained without the union and assistance of many. So, who does that sound like?
Locke.
Locke. And how so?
The social contract idea that that we have to band together to protect our lives, liberty, and properties often, and that requires usually that we set up some form of government, and hence government's only purpose would be to protect those rights.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if we think about that, and thank you for that summary, Wendy. So Walter, here's a question for you, okay? If the government's duty is to protect property, among other natural rights, then why is taxation ever a good thing, perhaps?
Well, if you have representation, then it could be a good thing because you'd be kind of I remember it saying somewhere in here, I think it was the second page, that people wouldn't do very well on their own. They wouldn't be able to get very far, and I think this is part of it. And I think this is part of it. I just lost my train of thought.
That's okay. Okay, well, if the train gets back on track, let us know, okay?
Okay.
Okay. Well, so then maybe, Wendy, if the government's only purpose is to protect life, liberty, and property, and taxation takes away property, then how is taxation, or when is taxation ever justified?
Well, I personally don't think taxing income or anything that you want to promote is ever a good idea. Mm-hmm. But taxing through other things like tariffs and trade and things that you don't want to promote, like the reliance of your country on other countries for basic needs. So, in other words, getting tax income from those other things, I would think, would be justified only to pay for the protection of life and liberty, like armies and police and jails and policemen and fire stations and things like that.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, right? There are certain times where we give up, right, voluntarily, it should be, where we voluntarily give up a little bit of one of those basic three rights, right, in order to secure the greater protection of the others, right? Not things other than those sort of big three of life, liberty, and property, right? This isn't taxation to do anything, right? All taxation, as we know, isn't just a good thing. And so I love what Wendy said, right? I mean, there are certain times where, yeah, to protect our life, right? Yeah, maybe we do need to, I don't know, fund a fire station or a police station. To protect our liberty, maybe we do need to pay for protection by the armed forces, right? And doing that, we have to give up a little bit of private property, but, right, as the Americans of the revolutionary generation would say, it has to be by consent. It's got to be something that we think, well, okay, government in doing this is fulfilling its purpose, right, the purpose for which we created it, which is to better protect life, liberty, or property, these natural rights. So any other thoughts about that? Okay.
Well,
go
I
ahead.
think it's more. It should be more than just the consent of the governed. I think if the consent of the governed is to tax us to help the poor, I think we've got to talk about more than just it's okay because the governed consented. Mm-hmm. I think the principle that at that point you need to educate the public that
right.
that what the purposes of the just purposes of taxation are for.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So what you're saying is that you can have a group of people who, by majority, consent to something that's wrong. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that is an incredibly important distinction to make, and I think it's something that will become more and more evident as the years of history continue to fly by. And so we do have that duty to stick to true principles of government and also morality. And so thank you for bringing that up. I do appreciate it.
I think
Well,
it was well stated by Ezra Taft Benson when he explained that if I don't have the right to go to my neighbor's house and demand that he hand over $100 for someone who's poor in the neighborhood at the point of a gun or at the threat of being jailed, then I don't have the right to give my government that right.
mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, and I appreciate you pointing out that distinction between forced charity, right, or involuntary charity, and then charity of free will or voluntary charity, right? Because aren't we all supposed to be trying to take care of each other, right? But yet we have agency, and that agency should be honored. So thank you so much for that. Well, as we go here, we've talked a little about Locke, and so how does and this is for Walter. So Walter, everything we're talking about today so far, how does it relate to Locke's consent of the governed?
Well, we were just talking about taxation without representation. That's consent of the governed, and that's the main thing. And yeah, that's the main thing.
Yeah, excellent, right? I was actually hoping that you would use those very words, no taxation without representation, right? Because that's the argument that we hear over and over again from the colonists in so many words. And so I think it's very important because this is just the start. Think about it. Here we are, 1764, okay? In another 10 years, we will have the Coercive Acts. And another year after that, we'll have Lexington and Concord. And then in a year after that, we'll have independence. And so it's at least a Declaration of Independence. So it's very important to think about how this is just the very beginning. And so, sure, there are lots of ideas that come straight from the Glorious Revolution and have sort of maybe been passed around through people like Trenchard and Gordon through the years in newspapers and pamphlets, and they've affected Otis, and he's bringing up these same concepts. As we continue to talk, the ideas of the colonists will become much more sophisticated and specific to their plights, to their problems in the empire at this point. But it's important to remember that Otis is writing this as a loyal member of what he would call the Empire of Liberty, right? He's saying, well, I want to work for redress within the empire. I don't need to be without it or outside of it in order to get what I want at this point. There is still a faith that things could be remedied within the empire. Okay, so here's the next question then. Do you think that, in your reasoning, do you think that Otis would agree or disagree with the following? Unless and until the colonists were represented in Parliament, Parliament could not legally and constitutionally tax them.
Yes, I think he'd agree with it.
I think you'd agree with it. Okay, and why would you say that?
Well, just we've been talking about consent of the governed, and like I said, no taxation without representation, and this is unless and until the colonists were represented in Parliament. So the represented, that's representation, cannot legally and constitutionally tax them.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's right. Now I'll try to play devil's advocate here. The British would say that the Americans were represented in Parliament. Now, how could they possibly be represented in Parliament? They didn't have any Americans sitting over there in England. how do you think the British would say that they were represented?
Maybe they would think that the colonists were just from England, and so the people that were in England were representing them.
Okay, okay. What about Wendy? Do you have any idea what the British would have said to rebut this statement?
I don't know, but maybe just that they figured that they were indirectly represented in the fact that whatever was in the best interest for the colonies was in the best interest for England. That England, the king and Parliament would always keep America in its in their best interest because they were interested in making the colony thrive. Just to prosper themselves, really.
Yeah, no, it's very true, because what you're talking about was a political philosophy known as virtual representation. Now, I know when we hear virtual these days, we think of people putting on like a headset and then, swinging golf clubs in the living room, imagining that they're on, Augusta National or something. But this virtual, right, is just as Wendy said. It is that the British felt that just like there were many people who couldn't vote in districts in England for one reason or another, and that their interests were also taken into consideration by fellow Englishmen in Parliament, that the Americans who couldn't have a place at the table were also considered. And like Wendy said, right, their best interest was at heart, and so they were represented because they were Englishmen, and Englishmen sat in Parliament. And so, of course, they would do what was best for them. Now, okay, what would we say about that argument of virtual representation? Does it fly with us or not?
Well, clearly, our best interest ends where where we cease to benefit you. They obviously they were willing to dump so much money into the French and Indian War because they thought they would get something out of it, and once they would cease, once that the scales would weigh out of their favor, that we weren't prospering them enough, that virtual representation would cease to exist.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I love how you talked about self-interest there, right? Remember, we've talked about virtue on one hand in terms of organizing a government as a principle, and then self-interest on the other. And here, obviously, this is clearly about self-interest. And what do you think, Walter? Can virtual representation work for the Americans?
No, I don't think so, because you couldn't have people from California representing people from like Utah or Idaho or something, because those people would have different views than the people that were in Idaho or Utah or wherever else.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. I think it is very interesting because as we think about the interests of Great Britain, the colonies really weren't even that important to them compared to some other colonial ventures that they had. For example, the West Indies. If we think about the West Indies, here I just have some numbers for you to throw out, just to consider, right? And so during the reign of George III, right, the West Indies contributed to 13% of all imports in the British Empire in 1770, compared to 6% for the colonies. In 1772, 23% for the West Indies, compared to 14% for the colonies. In terms of exports, we think about that the West Indies always had less. Now, in terms of exports, why might it be important to have less? For example, in 1770, the West Indies had 4.6, and then the mainland colonies had 7.7. And then in terms of exports, British exports, 12% from the West Indies, and then 19%. So what does that tell you there? Who's generating more wealth if you put those numbers together?
You kind of blanked out for me. I didn't hear part of what you were saying. You're saying that the West Indies always had that British imported more things from the West Indies than the colonies, and they always exported less things to West Indies. Is that what you said?
That's right. So what is that telling you about the relationship there?
Well, you're saying that they were buying a lot from the West Indies but not selling a lot to the West Indies, right?
Right.
Okay.
And so in the balance then, which relationship would have been more important financially? The relationship with the West Indies or with the colonies?
Well, I guess you could say, I guess it depends on what you value more, the things you're buying or the things you're selling.
It's true. Well, another way to think of it, too, is that if you're importing more, the thing is these were sold, right? These were sold from the West Indies, and they were making money as they were imported, right, and then sold within mainland England. But then export, that meant that they had to give them less things, right, for their maintenance. Do you see how that might be another way to think of it?
Oh, okay. So they don't have to provide them very many raw materials, but they're getting a lot of goods back.
Right. So they can sell a lot, but they don't have to put out a lot to keep them going.
Okay. So clearly the West Indies would be favored.
Right. You know, and so just to get back to your question, I mean, really, in terms of virtual representation, the West Indies would come before the colonies in terms of self-interest. So really, they're even lower on the pecking order in terms of imperial priorities, right? Because it's all about who's generating the most sort of net wealth, which is interesting to consider. Now, Walter, are you still there? I think you've gone offline.
So that's still not clear to me, because right now America's in a position where we import a ton of things and export very little, and that puts us in a very weak position. Mm-hmm. So to me, from my personal standpoint, I value exports more than I value imports. So why does it seem to have a reverse notion of value with what you're talking about?
Right. Well, Britain was able to export a lot of things elsewhere and make money that way.
Oh, okay.
But just in terms of keeping up the colonies in the West Indies,
I see.
It was good for them not to have to put out as much.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then let's just do a little bit here as I get this, if I can get this slide to advance. Okay, here we go. Just a little bit of a review, and then I have some final relating questions. So first of all, remember, Otis protested as a loyal member of what he would call the Empire of Liberty. His pamphlet questioned the constitutionality of parliamentary taxation. It attacked both the sugar duties and the stamp taxes that were proposed by Grenville in March of 1764. Now
obviously, there's a lot more than what we read, because I don't really see number 2 or number 3.
That's right. Yeah, this is a review of his total argument.
Okay.
And things that we kind of touched upon, but no, you didn't read all of these things.
Okay.
So, yeah. Don't worry, you're not missing it.
Well, I even had trouble making the jump to taxation without representation in his work. I really couldn't find that clearly there. So.
Yeah. Well, maybe next time I should include a longer excerpt too, just because I mean, I'm just curious. How long did it take you to read the 3 pages?
Oh, I have no idea. Half an hour. It's you really sit there. You read each sentence a couple times to get it. But I have no idea really.
Okay. Yeah, and it looks like Walter has left. Well.
Yeah.
That's too bad. Anyway. Okay. So it's interesting to note that Grenville believed that not only could Britain tax, but that it should tax the colonies. Now this sort of could and should, believe it or not, would actually change in the opinions of different prime ministers between Grenville, who started in 1763, and then Lord North, who finished up in 1782. And it's very interesting to see as the prime minister changes, how the acts change and how things are repealed and how there's sort of periods of calm, and then we'll have a flare-up again with a new prime minister and that sort of thing. Anyway, but we'll get into that.
do you have a timeline for this section like you did for the Glorious Revolution?
Yeah, I do have a timeline for this section that I have that I actually printed out for my class here. But and I can certainly tell you where to find that, and I could even post it if you'd like me to. But one of the things that I am trying out with this section is actually to talk about each of the different points on the timeline at the beginning of every PowerPoint, so that we're sort of progressing together to see sort of the immediate connections between the events and then what we're reading.
Okay.
But of course. There's actually there's a nice time. I mean, you can find lots of timelines out there. The one that I printed for my class was actually from the British Museum, and it's just British Museum and then American Revolutionary Timeline. Now, is that something that you'd like me to put up here, or is that something that you'd like to just find on your own?
I just thought I maybe missed it because it was in the last set of documents. I thought maybe I just missed it.
Right. Yeah. No, I actually chose just to try a different tactic, just to see if we could make those events on the timeline more meaningful by connecting them more immediately to what we're reading.
Okay.
So we'll see. You can let me know which you think is more effective.
Well, I just know that it would kind of be nice to have in one place the dates of these different acts and who was prime minister and who was but I don't know. I'm willing to give it a try.
Okay. Well.
And you know what?
Sure.
Since your voice dropped out when you were asking that question, and that's about the same time that Walter left, I'm wondering if he just assumed, so there were technical difficulties. He probably had the same problem I did for a while. So.
Oh yeah.
Back when we were talking about imports and exports, that's when your voice dropped out for about a minute.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just talking away. Oh, well, I'm sorry about that, and I'm not sure why that happened. Well, let's see here. If we continue on. Okay. And so also, right, of course, as we've been talking about, Otis attacked Parliament's authority to tax for revenue. Right? He said that absolute power resided in the whole people and that they could entrust it to whomever they wished. Right? It's important to note, too, that though Britons had entrusted their absolute power to Parliament, Parliament could not act contrary to the laws of nature. Right? And so that's where that brings us back to our discussion of Locke when we were talking about those three main natural rights that they should protect, that they shouldn't violate.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, Wendy, what were you saying?
I'm just saying nothing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Just the idea that we have to have inalienable rights that nobody can overthrow.
Right, and even consent, right?
Right.
Excellent. And so, once again, it shouldn't violate that constitutional maxim of the British that stated that men should be taxed by their representatives, and of course, there should be no taxation without consent. And so, by extension then, and this is what we were talking about at the very end, Otis also talks about in his pamphlet that he believed that virtual representation didn't work, so he called for the colonists to have American representatives sit in Parliament, which is this actual representation. Now, why do you think that just wouldn't work? And it never did.
They'd just become Britons. They'd cease to be colonists. They'd have to live over there so long.
Right. I mean, in an age where, cross-Atlantic flights didn't occur, it's really hard to have a pulse on what's going on in the colonies when you're just living in Britain, or when you're sailing back and forth every 2 months, right? And so that it was Otis's dream. He really hoped for it, but as we see with Delaney, the colonial mind would move past it very quickly because it just was so unfeasible.
Physically impossible.
Yeah, physically impossible. Also, until Britons gave Americans actual representation, he believed that it had no legal or constitutional authority to tax them. And so this just brings us to the last two questions today as we finish up, right? So what lessons from history do you learn from our discussion today, and how do they relate to you?
Well, I'm just kind of back to the idea that that Americans today are, although we might be operating under the consent of the governed, it's still we're still ignoring basic principles.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost feel like we are experiencing taxation without representation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, even though we have all the framework in place to make it look like we have representation, there's so much corruption and bribery and special rights and lobbying and so many other things that make our representatives make it they're really not representing our best interests anymore. They are under somebody else's control by choice.
Right. So you see it almost as more virtual.
If not worse.
If not worse. So virtual, if not worse.
I don't think they even consider what's in the interest of their constituents, because they're getting lobbying and money and so much money from other interests that they have ceased to represent us, and they are now representing the special interest groups.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, I appreciate that. Very perceptive analysis. It's interesting because, well, I guess I'm supposed to be in PE class, but I'm sorry. I mean, just to wrap up, I just want to say, please try to pay attention to how the arguments shift, sometimes subtly and sometimes not so subtly, from 1764 with Otis all the way through 1776, because you'll see a progression of
our whole course this go around. You mean not just between here and Delaney, but all the readings. You mean?
Right. I mean all the readings from the American Revolution.
Okay.
Because there is a very interesting sort of trajectory of revolution in terms of which arguments are held, which arguments are cast away, how the arguments change for the purposes of the situation, and how they eventually lead, I mean, just so logically, one thing falls away after another until finally the only thing that's left is the king, and then when he is figuratively killed by Thomas Paine and we'll talk about Jefferson's summary view, and we'll talk about the Declaration, and once that last tie is cut, I mean, revolution and that recreation of government, right, by the consent of the people, is just the only inevitable step. And so it's very interesting to just notice from here we start with, I mean, this is the most conservative of all the positions, where, basically, even though this was, of course, radical at the time, right, you have Otis saying, no, I want rights within the British Empire. We can make things better. This is the Empire of Liberty. I'm a loyal British subject. And then let's see where it goes from here.
Okay. Interesting.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Wendy.
All right,
and I hope you have a great day. So I'll see you a week from
Wednesday.
today. Yep,
right.
Wednesday, because of the school break.
All right, thanks. Have a
Okay,
good time.
thanks so much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.